Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May the peace, the mercy and the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be upon you. And many congratulations for making it to the final video of the course. Now this is the last video, so I'm going to start by asking you to make sure that you've got all of your notes together from what we've done so far. So there's been 7 videos. In most of the videos you're meant to have been making notes. So based on the notes that you've made so far, you should be able to gather a really good understanding of what you've learnt so far. And essentially you should be able to write down exactly what you have learnt from this course. So you should be able to go through all of your notes, take a look at them, see what you've learnt, and then have a summary of what you've learnt. So you've got 2 or 3 main things which you've taken away from this course. And obviously that's going to be in your own time. Try and take out time to actually go through your notes. What I'm going to do today for the final video is share 2 things which I think are really important for you to take away from this course. So I'm going to go into them and make sure that you understand both of them and why they're so important for you to learn. Now the 2 things which I think are really important are 2 shifts in perspectives. So it's actually a change in the way that you perceive something else. Yeah. So number 1 is a shift in your perspective of prayer. And that kind of means that, do you see your prayer as a burden, or do you see it as something more than that? So that's what will shift by doing this course. And the second really important thing which you attain, and the second shift which happens, is in your perspective of mistakes. So how do you perceive mistakes? So when you think of a mistake, how do you kind of relate to that? Are you scared of it? Do you not like mistakes? Or are you kind of excited at the idea of making a mistake? So those are the 2 shifts in perspectives which we're going to work on. How you perceive your prayer, and whether or not you perceive it as a burden, and how you perceive mistakes, and whether or not you perceive it as kind of a scary thing. So the first perspective shift is your prayer a burden? So instead of you perceiving your prayer as a burden, after doing the 4 weeks and going through all the exercises, one thing which will happen is you'll stop seeing your prayer as a burden. Yeah. And obviously this is something which happens on scale. It's not like you do or you don't. There's a level of it. You can kind of see your salah as a burden, kind of as a real burden, or you can kind of think of it as a burden, or you may be at a stage where you don't think of it as a burden at all. But definitely after working on it in this way for 4 weeks, your salah will stop feeling like a burden. And one of the ways that we do that is that when we're praying our salah, or even when we're just thinking about our prayer, if we notice that we do think our prayer is a burden, we don't become really scared of this. Well, we're actually aware of that sometimes we consider this prayer, this spiritual exercise, because it's quite repetitive, we consider it to be like a burdensome activity, and sometimes we're trying to get away from it. And we've noticed that, and now we're actually, because we're not scared of it anymore, we've actually just noticed it, we're so much better positioned to be able to let go of the feeling of the prayer being a burden. So that's something which is really, really useful. And this is really useful because then when you realize that you sometimes think that your prayer is a burden and you don't worry about that too much, the one thing which is important, which we're able to do, is actually carry on with the work. We can still put in the practice to transform our prayer from a burden to something which you enjoy. Now, when you've done a 4-week course on that, what this course does is it means that you no longer have to worry about whether or not that happens when you pray. Now when you pray, you automatically go into the motions of transforming your prayer from a burden to spiritual ecstasy. So that's something which will happen by itself, and you'll notice that. Now, for those of you that want to go a little bit deeper here, what you can do is you can ask yourself a question. And the question which you can ask here, if you want to go a bit deeper, is my salah a burden? Do I feel that my prayer is a burden? And when you ask yourself that question, you can kind of, think about it a little bit, because now you've probably thought about it enough, so it doesn't scare you too much anymore. But when you think of this, that is my salah a burden at the moment, then hopefully by working on it like this for 4 weeks, by the end of it, you won't think that it is anymore, and you'll realize that no, it's actually a really important exercise which I do, which connects me to Allah. And that's what some of you might be thinking, well, I don't get that answer, I get the other answer. So even if you ask yourself that question, is my salah a burden? And you think, well, yeah, of course it's a burden, it was very difficult and I don't really enjoy it. And that might come up. But if that comes up, you can actually realize that sometimes that isn't actually you. It might be that you've just slipped into blame mentality and a mentality of not being grateful. You might just slip down, you just become a bit unconscious and slipped into that kind of mentality. And because you've done this course, you'll know that in terms of your spiritual growth, you can be in victim stage where you're blaming, or you can be in control. You can actually decide that it's you who decides what happens in your life. And then, to be honest, when we're praying, and simply by following the exercises of improving the way that you do things, in our prayer we'll actually have realized that to some extent it's actually not even us needing to be in control. It's actually Allah who decides what happens. We're just enacting the decree of Allah. And that's what prayer actually gives us, that realization that we're able to, in terms of our spiritual growth, we're able to experience a stage where we realize we don't have to be so much in control, but it's actually just Allah's plan, and Allah's in control, and it simply happens through us. And that's really, really important. For those of you that do want to go deeper, a really powerful question to ask yourself: is my prayer a burden? And if you feel that it is, what is it that we blame to make our prayer a burden? You might just realize, just by asking that question, you're actually able to notice the stages of your own spiritual growth. And obviously the more you practice in your prayer, the more those will become clearer and kind of easier for you to recognize, inshallah. So I wanted to cover the two perspectives today which shift because of doing this course. Number one is whether or not your prayer is a burden, and we just covered that. How by doing this course you'll realize that your prayer is not a burden. And the other perspective, so the way that you see your prayer will be not as much as a burden, you'll see it much more as a project, and you'll notice that actually transforming your salah from burden to spiritual growth is actually a habit. It's just it's a daily practice. It's something you do every day. So it stops being a burden, and obviously based on what we just said. And the second perspective which I wanted to shift, or make sure that this course has shifted for you, is the way that you perceive mistakes and doing something wrong. Because sometimes we kind of run away from them and we don't like them. And just taking a look, and you might find this in your notes, that when you ask yourself these questions and apply curiosity to the way that we pray, and obviously what happens is when we slow down and we go down deep into the letter, we're prepared to say them wrong, we actually break the barriers between ourselves and our mistakes. That's when we realize how much we miss out by not making mistakes. So definitely the second shift I want you to make sure that you've taken away is that mistakes are the point of growth. When we're on the training ground, our prayer is not a performance. Our prayer is meant to be a practice. We're not trying to perform to anybody, we're practicing. So when we're on this training ground, we're trying to really be happy with making mistakes. And when we appreciate them, we realize that it's just so much, we just learn so much quicker, and we're able to open up so much more. And there's a certain element of, we spoke about, there's a whole video on attachment and not being too attached. But that is kind of why it's so important to not be overly attached to a certain outcome. and you're actually happy, you're trusting the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the way that he's taught us how to pray, as being the perfect way of praying. And all you have to do is just carry it out. And there's not like, we don't have to always be pushing so hard, and therefore not being that scared of our mistakes. And because of that, we realize that we're exactly where we're meant to be. We're progressing on our journey perfectly. So I really want you to use this opportunity right now and after this video, the time that we have before our final get together on Saturday, to actually go through your notes, make sure you know what you've learned so far, and figure out any questions that you have as well for yourself, and what you think you should be doing next as well. You might have noticed as you look back on the course that in terms of posture you might need to put some work in there, in terms of recital you might need to put some work in there, and that's very easily going to guide you into what you can do next to carry on improving the way that you pray. So I'm really glad you've made it to the end, and I'll see you on the call on Saturday. And I look forward to your comments. You know, you can ask your questions here down below. You can ask your questions on the WhatsApp group, and I look forward to receiving your comments and answering any queries that you have. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.